Hello, and welcome to Being Becoming Podcast. Together, we are being honest in conversations about thoughts we're having and books we're reading, in the hopes of becoming better, more able versions of our current selves. My name is Logan Hauer. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 8, Tell the Truth, or at least Don't Lie, from 12 Rules for Life and Antidote for Chaos by Jordan Peterson. I'm joined today by my two co-hosts, Austin Stone and Patrick Dyer. Fellas, how we doing today?
Excellent.
Hello.
Awesome. And just kind of a little overview of this chapter. It starts with personal anecdotes from Jordan's life, but it also discusses totalitarianism, different philosophy/philosophers such as Soren Kierkegaard, Solzhenitsyn, Viktor Frankl. And Frankl is a psychologist, I believe, but probably dabbles in philosophy and psychology. Also, religions discussed. There's Buddhism, or at least a reference to Buddhism and Judaism, Christianity, as well as a couple scriptures pertaining to Christianity that get referenced. Ancient Egyptian religion and beliefs are referenced as well. And then there's a lot of setting goals, setting goals and ambitions, and then truth, and which is obvious from the title of this chapter, but I wanted to turn it to you guys first to just get any opening thoughts, ideas, and questions.
Tell the truth, or at least don't lie.
Right.
Best advice there is.
I like how he mentioned psychologist Alfred Adler referring to life lies when you're kind of betraying your own conscience.
I thought it was really interesting how often he mentioned sacrifice throughout the chapter.
That seems to be a recurring theme in a couple chapters, the sacrifice.
Over and over, for sure.
Austin, I agree, though, the life lies, I was not familiar with that term, or even who Alfred Adler was before reading this chapter. But is it fair to say that a life lie is manipulating reality in your favor? Is that the way you understood it?
Yeah, that for sure. And as it relates to other people in your life, he has a quote: "If you will not reveal yourself to others, you cannot reveal yourself to yourself." I mean, you just can't. You can't live on an island. And if you're not revealing yourself to others, then you can't really be living in the truth anyway. So
I think he talks about the two premises for the person that would be believing or living in that way, that false way of reality. And the premises are: current knowledge is sufficient to define what is good now and forever into the future.
yeah.
And then reality left to its own devices would be unbearable. And I thought that was really interesting too. Do you think that aligns with what you were just discussing in your definition as well?
It just reminds me of the chaos and order, the yin yang, the consciousness, right? Like we have to be consciously adapting and learning. And if you decide to just live life in a straight line and that's all you want to do is stick to this one ideology and bend reality around it, you're going to find yourself living a lot of life lies and walking the road of totalitarianism.
Yeah, I thought the first premise within that life lie really hit me too, where everything that needs to be known is known by me right now in this moment. And it seems an arrogant position to hold, for one, but for two, it doesn't allow for any future learning or development the way I understood it. Which is kind of funny because it's almost the opposite of what our aim is here on the podcast, is accepting we don't know everything we need to know right now, but that's okay. We're grappling with the being that we are, this human being in this world, and then hopefully we're looking at what we want to learn or could learn from each other and from other people or other texts in order to become someone that's more responsible for being a citizen of this great world that we inhabit. So it's very interesting that premise especially is held And I can understand why it would be held by people, because I think there's a certain safety or comfortability within that. With what I know right now is sufficient. It's good for all of my life, and it needs to not change. I think that there's a safety and a comfortability in that of, I know everything I need to know right now, because it's dangerous to admit that you got something wrong. There could be reputational consequences or fallouts with people, not to mention your own source of pride being hurt of, can I even trust myself if I'm getting these things wrong? So just curious to get any of your guys' thoughts.
Pat, Logan touched on it, Patrick, but what do you think is the temptation to be solidified in your thinking, in your knowledge? Like, what's the temptation in that?
Provides comfort, for sure. Allows an avenue for laziness to not grow, which is very attractive because that takes effort and hard work. And then also, I think probably I might be able to just read it from this page. On 212, there's a little section at the bottom, and it kind of goes along with the question you were just asking. Like, I guess you have to temporarily take in a stance of weakness to admit that you don't know everything and that you need to not be living a lie. That's not what he says here, but reworded, I guess I could argue that.
Yeah, that's a good paragraph you pointed out, too.
There's another idea I want to introduce from a different book that I had just finished reading a couple months ago. And the book is called The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek. And he introduces in chapter 9 of the book about one of the things we crave most is being safe and comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we're willing to, for the sake of that goal of being comfortable and safe, we're willing to let things happen around us that we don't necessarily agree with. And his argument in that book is one of the things being the rise of the corporate state, handling things on our own behalf, even though we don't necessarily agree with all of it, but we're all kind of profiting off of it, and we don't have a high risk of losing our jobs. We know that that corporation's going to be there tomorrow, and it's a level of safety everyone's comfortable with. But then that corporation starts doing sketchy things. And I think Jordan even relates this in his book too, where his relation is more in totalitarian states, which Hayek's book is also very much concerned about, but how you start noticing things you're not necessarily okay with. You don't say anything though, because you're doing well for yourself, or maybe it's just too inconvenient or uncomfortable to call it out. Jordan argues in the book, you set a precedent. If you're not speaking up the first time you see something, then you're just going to keep allowing it to happen until it grows out of control. And by the time you are ready to take action, it's too late. This chapter, I think, does tie into certain aspects of that book that I read, just maybe in different ways, where one's more concerned with economics, being the Hayek book, or economic philosophy, and this is more concerned with personal, individual psychology and responsibility.
That's a good tie-in, Logan.
Yeah, that is. Jordan even says, I saw this recently on Instagram. I think he does say it in the book somewhere, but he says, if you have something to say and don't say it, you're lying. And that ties in quite well with what you just said, and that's kind of scary to think about, because I know personally there's been a lot of times where I've definitely had something to say or something to be done and had not, but I never considered that as lying. But I know what he means, I think, or I can see where he goes with it.
Yeah, it's tough because I'm an agreeable person. Would you guys say you're agreeable as well?
Unfortunately.
Yes.
Because I would say I don't even think about it as lying, to what you were alluding to, Pat, with what Peterson says in the book. I think the way I think about it is, you know what? I know it's going to upset this person. It's too much of a burden. I'm going to just take it on myself. It's not worth bringing up. But I think there's even some arrogance in thinking that way, where I can't control how that person is going to react, but maybe they do need to know that this thing is bothering me, or that I don't think it's right. Even if they're going to push back against me, maybe that's a conversation worth having. but one of my core tendencies or desires is to keep the peace.
Same.
Which I do like and appreciate that about myself. However, it does run into complications and issues when it comes to the material of this chapter, where maybe there is sometimes I do need to speak up in order to make my world and the world around me a better place. Maybe I do need to actually throw my ideas out into the ether or share something vulnerable with someone, even though I'm not sure quite how they're going to take it.
I'm the exact same way. I 100% can sympathize with that, and I empathize with that rather. And unfortunately, he says it in this chapter as well. So let's just say for sure, when we have something we need to say in regarding to keeping the peace, or rather we don't say it to keep the peace or whatever, but it's something we needed to say and we're sinning or we're creating an error, he says later that that's going to necessitate sacrifice. And then the longer you put this off, you become in debt to the amount of sacrifice you're going to owe to make this right. And so it's really interesting to think like that goes back to the chapter we talked about last time, pursuing something expedient versus meaningful. It's way more meaningful to present the idea of the issue now than it would be to not, because not doing it would be easier, more comfortable now, but in later it's going to require more to correct it. And I hate that.
That's a great tie-in, Pat, between the two chapters. I like that.
That's a fascinating thought, Patrick. Okay, so sacrifice is voluntary, right?
Sometimes. In fact, he says actually just right here, 2:13, error necessitates sacrifice to correct it. So if it necessitates, that's no longer voluntary, it's mandatory.
Well, I kind of think you can put it off until you die.
You probably could, but how serious of a consequence could you have avoided or create?
That makes sense. Error necessitates sacrifice because our sin requires a sacrifice of our present to please. It makes sense, but I don't know how to word it.
So it's kind of you have to choose the necessity in a way. So it's both, it's back to that yin and yang. It's both a choice and a mandate in a way.
I think to your point, Austin, the person could delay or even reject making the sacrifice, but then at the very least, maybe it's something that nags at you or you take to the grave that you'll regret. I feel like there's going to be some kind of ramification, though, at the very least. But then at the very most, maybe you turn into Cain from our discussion in the last chapter.
Right.
If you're resenting making the sacrifice, or you attempt at making the sacrifice, but it's not sufficient, maybe you start rolling down that path.
Totally. And I think that if you're not willing to sacrifice for your error now, the punishment will snowball. I think that's so good, Patrick. You pointed that out. Error necessitates sacrifice. I think that's psychologically true.
I want to revisit actually a question. I can't remember which one of you posed it kind of at the beginning of that point. Does it have to be the person making the sacrifice? Do you remember asking that question? Can't remember how you worded it.
Well, I just asked if sacrifice is voluntary.
Yeah, in my mind at least, sacrifice, it requires it being voluntary. Otherwise, someone's just taking something from you. Because I could sacrifice my water bottle. I'm just looking at that. But is there a way that I could sacrifice the water bottle without my doing so?
I think there's an English sentence structure to say something like, the sacrifice happened to me. I didn't want to have to sacrifice this, but because I chose path A, effect B happened to me. So because I had to go somewhere on vacation, I had to sacrifice a mountain vacation for a beach vacation.
Opportunity cost. Okay. So the circumstance dictated.
No, I disagree with what I was saying, but I was just trying to think of, is it possible for a sacrifice to happen to you?
There's an aspect you're touching on too that's interesting to me, where it's almost like the cheerful giver in air quotes.
Yes, I was going to say that too.
Because I think that's more or less what you're kind of getting at, Austin, is maybe sacrifice. Okay, it's the self that's doing the performing the sacrifice, but what is my mentality? Am I doing it reluctantly? Am I holding back? Or am I doing it because I'm giving freely? I'm giving towards a better future, even though it's costing me something in the moment.
That's why an unaccepted sacrifice breeds resentment if you're not willing to humble your pride.
Wow.
So if your sacrifice that you've made, if you're making sacrifices in your life and they don't work, it's easy to become resentful about that. But your two paths are resentment or humble your pride so that you can figure out how to better sacrifice. Because you sacrificed something and it didn't work. I think on one of Peterson's podcasts, he says, in some European country, I think, you can only take like this law test once. Like you go 4 years of school and you fail it, you cannot become a lawyer in this certain situation ever again. So you sacrifice all this time and you weren't good enough.
Wow.
New path job for you now. So like, gosh dang, you could become really resentful about that. Or you can cut the part of yourself that's dead and be like, okay, I guess I need to get rid of my pride and find a new path or live a life of resentment.
The bitterness piece is so interesting too, because you could, using that circumstance that you just gave as an example, where you're studying for this test and you only get one shot at it and you don't pass it, the temptation could be you could blame the rest of the failures of your life on that one test, because maybe you fail that test and instead of just getting another job or trying another thing, you give up altogether and you take a job that's not going to push you or challenge you, etc. And then inevitably you'll feel like a failure because you're not being pushed or trying your best or motivated. And then it's easy to blame the condition for you feeling that way. It's because I didn't pass this test that I'm where I am now. I could see that temptation.
There's a quote on 221 at the top talking about resentment and vengefulness. So Jordan Peterson says, "It is deceit that makes people miserable beyond what they can bear. It is deceit that fills human souls with resentment and vengefulness." Along with the situation that the example we just posed, it is really summarized by this right here.
How about this? Once you're done sacrificing, life can only happen to you. Once you're done sacrificing, the only thing left is complaining.
Huh.
Once you're done voluntarily taking on challenges, the only thing you have left is probably to just complain about the suffering of life instead of doing the work of transforming it.
Could you also just become apathetic, maybe? Disinterested altogether?
Probably.
Yeah, I think that's in bed with resentment for sure.
Yeah, that's fair. There's probably some overlap. Also, if you're in that state, that realm, nihilism would seem very enticing as well.
Surely it would.
What's the point to anything? What's the point in this? All this sacrifice. I'm done with that.
Here we are to postmodernism again. It always comes back to this.
I do feel like it's been funny how much nihilism's come up.
Well, it is the age we live in, boys.
It is, yeah.
Yeah,
it's
really
the water
is.
that we swim in.
Comes up a lot in the book too, understandably. It's funny because at times it seems like, okay, the option is sacrifice or complain. To what I think you were kind of alluding to, Austin. It's if we're not sacrificing, we're probably complaining, and it's the world's fault that we are the way that we are.
And it's really interesting to think when you choose a sacrifice, you're simultaneously picking an aim because you know the result or something like it that you want. And so that also ties way back to chapters earlier.
Yeah.
You're specifying what you want. You realize the sacrifice is necessitated.
You have to have some sort of future in mind when you're sacrificing. Yeah, because you're, dampening the quality of the present on purpose for a goal, for an aim.
Let's make a distinction here, too, between maybe an ideologue, someone that is willing to sacrifice quite a bit for an aim, or an ideal, but they're not willing to learn as they're progressing towards their goals. They're not willing to learn lessons of maybe my behavior should change, or maybe I'm wrong in this area. Maybe I don't need to sacrifice this. Maybe I should sacrifice this instead.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely.
You can sometimes be too willing to sacrifice and not willing enough to sit with yourself or to work through, are my goals actually worth achieving or worth attaining, and at what cost? Am I learning along the way? Am I correcting as I go? Or am I too set on my vision to make adjustments?
You're hopping on my question I wanted to ask about reason and totalitarianism, so I wanted to share that. So I think one of the most profound things I read in this chapter was when Peterson starts talking about reason and the error of reason and how that can lead to totalitarianism. And he compares, so when reason's positive feedback loop starts going and the error of reason, and like we can have this ideal of reason, but since we're human, we're going to create error in that, and there's going to be a positive feedback loop. So here's the quote, and when that happens, that can become Satan himself. So how is that? Here's the quote. Reason falls in love with itself, and worse, it falls in love with its own productions. 2 questions. Let me start with the first one. How can reason lead to the totalitarianism of Satan? How does this ideal, like, we think reason as a guiding light, right? But then how does it devolve into a totalitarian state? But then how do we think the reason of Satan devolves into hell itself? Those are the 2 questions. And then here's the more personal question. What in our lives are there ways in which our reason leads to hell itself?
Boy, those are some whoppers, Austin. I like those questions, but I think you asked a couple different components.
Yeah. Let me start with a personal one. So,
yeah,
reason seems like an ideal thing, right? Like, it gets us through math class. It helps us solve problems, right? How is it that can go wrong?
I see. Well, reason is alive, for one. It's not just a fact.
Well, it's like reason's goal is order.
Oh.
And the further that goes, like order begets order, and you have to be strict maintaining the order. And that just kind of snowballs.
I want to just add something to that. Maybe just restating what you've said, honestly, but what is currently known becomes the status of the absolute. I think that's almost directly something I pulled from Peterson, but we can reason ourselves into thinking this is the way it is because this is the way it's always been, and not recognizing there's new information, things have changed. Maybe change is required in the way I'm thinking about this or in the way that we're going about doing this.
And the suffering of life might throw a wrench in that kind of reason or that kind of order.
Right.
That's so good, Patrick.
Good stuff, fellas. What was the other part of your question, Austin?
It was a question about Satan. How do we think that he devolved? Because he was the most beautiful angel, right? And then he starts to think that he is worthy of all praise.
Maybe it's being rational, or rationality could dangerously border pride, right?
Say that one more time.
So if you're rational, the downside is you could become very prideful because you can explain a lot of things. And maybe in the case of Satan, this might be folklore too. I don't know if this is for certain, but I think at least the way it's referenced in the chapter and other places in historical texts is that Satan actually used to be one of God's favorite angels. So maybe that favoritism, along with his ability to rationalize, I don't know, maybe there was some pride there that would have come before the fall, no?
Yes, I would say so, for sure. That's very accurate.
Because it's your consciousness that is dividing chaos from order, I think pride has to live in that kind of consciousness, right? Because you're aware of what you're doing, right? And if you're doing this good thing of creating orders and structures that create meaning out of chaos, that's a good thing, right? And there's something to be prideful in that about, but then that can turn into the vice of pride, and that blinds your very conscious from doing the thing you were proud of in the first place.
Switches the game around.
So the way I understood what you just said is almost become enshrouded within this pride of this is the way that I do things, and it also means it's the right way to do things. The way it's like almost equating the way I do things is the right way to do things.
Yeah.
And there's just this pride that's enshrouded in that. When you come across an error, your own personal error especially, and that, as we've established, I think a couple minutes ago, might necessitate or does necessitate sacrifice.
Or just reason it away.
Right.
Yeah.
The temptation is, but wait, I'm right. I've been right. This must be wrong. And then, yeah, you can make an excuse in your mind, even though you know you're wrong. You can reason that you're right, or that this is just one exception. And that prideful, rational mind can then be tempted to ignore errors.
So you literally have to sacrifice your pride in order to address an error. So here's God saying, Lucifer, you're my favorite angel, and here's why you're my favorite. And Lucifer's like, yeah, I've made a lot of order out of chaos. I've created a lot of meaning. I've created a lot. Maybe he was he like music or beauty or something like that? And then he could think, maybe I'm actually better at that than you are, God. Maybe I actually deserve more praise than you do. And then that's where he starts reasoning away the error. That's Satan's life lie, right? That he deserves the glory that God does. So it's just this twisted thing, and then there he goes, getting sent out of heaven, and then there he goes on his project to overthrow.
Wow. And he can rationalize that too. No, I deserve this. You know what I mean? It's not only the feeling and the desire, but then it's that action, the willful manipulation of the deceit, trying to sway other people or God himself to your desire, which I think I should be careful though, because I do think there are times where you want to pray the will of God, but then you also want to clarify what your own desire is or what your own will is.
Yeah.
And I will say, I think at some point in this chapter too, he talks about the way previous generations understood the truth of sacrifice was essentially accepting the will of God and giving up your own personal will. It's something like that. I might not getting the exact verbiage right, but I do believe he says something to that effect.
That's wild.
Can we link that to the serpent's project in the Garden of Eden?
Hang on. Restate it again.
So we talked about how Lucifer's reason led him astray from the truth. Is that a similar thing that happens in the garden with Satan?
I guess yes. What I'm about to say next, I guess, doesn't really answer the question, but it's kind of just an observation. It's kind of interesting when he's confronting Eve and then Eve to Adam that he doesn't exactly tell them the truth, but he doesn't lie when he tells them they won't die. He's kind of advancing his own pride agenda, whatever you want to call it, through that. So I don't know. I just threw myself in the loop with thinking that, because now I have to reconsider something else I said earlier. So crap. Was he at the very beginning of the podcast when we were talking about, like, if you don't reveal yourself to others, you can't reveal yourself to yourself. And if you don't do that, then you weaken your character, and then people with weak character do cynical things.
Weak character does not fare well against adversity.
Yeah. And so is that this situation, or is it something totally different? It's kind of similar, kind of different. I could see it as well, but we don't know the angel's dynamic with God. And like, we believe and trust the story is true. And although we don't have a clue really how it played out, if we go by what Jordan Peterson writes, he's very prideful, so he doesn't reveal himself to others. So he probably wasn't revealing himself to God. So since he wasn't doing that, he didn't
Yep.
really know himself. And then so when you don't know yourself, you are enticed by your lusts. Those cause these, I guess, the weakness of yourself to show, I guess, because that's what builds up when you yourself are weak. And then that's what leads to the cynical things and the nihilistic things.
So this is what happens. Lucifer thinks he knows better than God.
Which is a lie.
Then let's say he goes to the garden as a serpent and says, "Hey, Adam and Eve, I want to see if you think you know better than God."
Ah, yeah, that's right.
It's almost like the lesson he's refused to learn, no? That Satan himself has refused to learn. And he's presenting it before unsuspecting victims.
And he's doing it out of pride, though. Kind of like what we were saying earlier.
Yeah.
Due to his reason. He is reasoning he can cause these lowly beings to fall.
Wow. I've never really questioned the serpent's motives. I just always thought, oh yeah, he's just evil. But there's a motive there. I think there's an actual character in the serpent himself.
I know I just said this. I'm kind of thinking about it for the first time as we're talking. I like the idea of it. It's a failed lesson on Satan's part, the serpent's part, that was not learned. And he's carrying that misinformation forward and presenting it to someone else.
He's trying to change the whole world around his life lie. And here God is to just say, hey, I'm just going to try to prove my love. I mean, you're going to corrupt against me, but I am a God of relationships, and here I am just going to prove my love throughout this thing.
And think, it is Eve's choice and decision to believe Satan, weakness in herself. Because God clearly states for her and Adam not to eat of the tree of good and evil, lest they die. She saw it was good for eating. Satan says, you won't die. She takes and eats. So is that nihilistic of her? Cynical of her?
That's a great question, Pat. And I want to bring in another part maybe of this chapter and things that Peterson has said maybe throughout this book to see if it kind of ties in. Could Satan have been intentionally twisting a truth that was later to become an archetype handed down to us, a lesson? But it's something about, becoming your own person, rejecting your father's vision and developing your own. Do you think Satan could have been playing with that archetypal lesson or story?
Yeah, I bet.
With God being referred to as our heavenly Father, obviously creator, created beings, father-like relationship. Do I reject the will of the Father to try to develop my own goal, desire, and ambition, etc.? Maybe the full consequence of their action was not known. Do you think that could have been Satan's intent all along, knowing that there is a desire to carve your own way, have your own identity, other than the one that's handed down from you from your parents, your father, etc.?
So, okay, if this doesn't relate, tell me. When you refuse to do the Father's will, isn't that the exact moment when you lose your vision of the truth?
Are you saying father being God or father being like paternal?
Father's will, also maybe tradition. If you refuse tradition altogether, or if you refuse to do the Father's will, you lose the vision of the truth, and you've thrown yourself into the realm of chaos.
I guess what I'm saying more is not about tradition.
Okay.
It's more about vision for your own life.
Okay.
Your father, your mother, whoever can't dictate that for you. You have to develop that for yourself. And it might end up that you disappoint your parents in decisions that you make because you're pursuing the truth in front of you. He talks about something to that extent. Because I hear what you're saying about you don't want to fix what isn't broken. You know, if people have been doing things either in your family or throughout the history of culture and that thing is good and it works, maybe we don't do away with it, like a rule or a law or something.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, maybe more what you're touching on. I'm saying, as far as like personal, individual vision for yourself in your own life, even though there's this dictate that's handed down to you, maybe your own desire is to go and do that thing anyhow.
Your own free will, yeah.
Yeah. I'm partially being a devil's advocate, but I'm also partially interested in this archetypal story, if you will, of the rejecting the vision the Father has for your life and embracing your own vision for your life. I think the Adam and Eve story is also a great lesson, archetype, whatever, of authority and sin and understanding boundaries, laws. I don't know to what extent they relate is what I'm saying, I guess, but
a thought I had while you're bringing up that point is surely Satan knew that Adam and Eve were made in the image of God, and knowing that that's probably how he was able to exploit Eve. We don't think about it like this, but God has his own will, but it's his own free will. He has the ability to choose, I think at least. And one of the key features of us being made in his image is also that feature, the ability to choose, to have freedom. Because without freedom, you don't have love, you don't have sacrifice, you don't have all these other things that we've talked about. And Satan definitely knows this. He has the same, maybe not the exact same image, of course, but one of the key features. I guess he knows how weak humans are on the surface level, and how much we want to create our own path, because there's a certain amount of pride with it, there's ease with it, there's all these other things, and that's probably what made him bend the truth to get Eve to fall to the temptation. And free will is in all parties here, God, Eve, Satan, and there's weaknesses when you have the ability to choose, and the only weaknesses are the expedient things. Eve was probably hungry or fulfilling some lustful desire.
I forget sometimes it's a literal fruit. Maybe it's that
up.
simple.
Yep.
Maybe she was hungry,
Yeah.
and that was one she hadn't tried and was enticing. And then you have the wrong person at the wrong time coming and saying something.
And think of your personality when you are hungry. I mean, you're usually irritable. You're usually... The expedient things are way more desirable when you're in that state.
There's actually a company that runs an ad campaign about that. You're not you when you're hungry. Not going to drop the name, but...
And I just have to mention that the serpent was trying to get Eve to think that God was the one who was lying.
Or he wasn't telling the whole truth.
Did God really say that you would die?
I would love to know the exact Hebrew translation. And think, had they ever seen God eat of the tree or something? Or had they seen another eat of the tree?
Right.
They need reason and evidence for that.
You had a giraffe kind of getting too close. They're like, no.
Yeah.
Would have been a very different story if the giraffe had plucked the fruit.
Yeah. I wonder how much time elapsed between the eating of the fruit and God discovering where they were. I mean, obviously God knew the whole time, but like they went and hid. How long were they hiding?
Enough time to make clothes.
And then it says, like, I know in the English, like, God came in the cool of the day. And like, oh, where are you guys? And they say, we're hiding. And like, I wonder how much time.
Wow. So here's my takeaway from all this, and it really rises up in my soul, is it shows my need for the Holy Spirit, because my reason is not enough.
Yeah. You will never, ever be enough.
I wrote this line down from the book, truth transforms values as you progress through life. But you could say maybe the same thing about the Holy Spirit. Holy Spirit transforms you as you progress through life.
Yeah.
Yeah, do we really know what the truth is? Which is what Pilate asked. Guess what? It's a person.
Yeah.
Austin, we might not know what the truth is at all times, but surely your soul will reject the tyranny of your will, so you can know what is not true.
Peterson is all about that.
You can't impose your quote-unquote will on your soul, is what I take from that. So be truthful to yourself.
Wow.
So I know we're running short on time, but there are a couple things kind of within this realm of truth and seeing the truth that I wanted to touch on because it had resonated very strongly with me personally. Page 225 specifically. Here's a quote from 225. You may not want to sacrifice your childish belief in parental omniscience, wishing devoutly to continue believing that there is someone who knows you better than you know yourself, and who also knows all about the world. that one hit me because it is difficult to accept that you have to be responsible for your own self at the end of the day, and not your parents, not your friends, not your spouse, not whoever. You know yourself best. Someone else isn't going to make decisions that are going to make you happy. You have to take control and do it yourself.
In that matter, there are no atheists. There are only people who know and don't know what God they serve.
Bingo.
That's a quote at the top of the same page he was reading from. 225.
Yeah.
Wow. Well said.
Yeah.
Holy crap.
And that reminds me of the Bob Dylan song. You gotta serve somebody. Gotta serve somebody. Yeah. Said whether you're rich or you're poor, you gotta serve somebody.
We can clip that and put it all throughout the
Please
episode.
do.
Or maybe just at the beginning. Yeah.
Copyright issues, but yes.
Yeah, copyright infringement, lawsuit impending. Stay tuned.
Unfortunately, we don't have near enough time ever in the day, but just this chapter and last chapter make me think so much just of how it relates to like mental health, because obviously that's such a big buzzword and big thing today. And just to touch on it real quick, just all the high anxiety and depression people, like, and having been one of them, it's just like it really, without the aim, without telling the truth, it really snowballs and spirals when you're not constantly sacrificing, when you're not pursuing the aim. This book has helped me come out of things like that, just because the way he
Patrick
states things. Yeah. And so it's a very important message that we have to live, to get it out to others, and it'll be their choice to listen or not.
I think part of that too that resonates with me is the vulnerability that you have to have, either reading this book or looking at your own life. However people are going about doing that, the vulnerability required to even before the sacrifice or during and after. And
it goes back to what we talked about on page 212. If you are not being vulnerable to someone else, you cannot know yourself. And how, yeah, it's crazy. And it reminds me of a lyric from one of my favorite artists named James Clay. He's talking about, the song's about prayer to God. And man, what's the song called? Anyway, I'll think of it later. But he says a lyric like, "Can I hear what you won't say?" And he's speaking from God's perspective. And so it's like, it's the same way with our relationship with God.
Yes.
And so, dang it.
Yeah. Our need for others is the same need we have for the Holy Spirit. We need exactly. That vulnerability, that communication line.
And I wanted to say that too when we were talking about Satan, because like think of how far Satan had to go in removing himself from God. Like he must have been holding something in and not telling God, and it had to have led to this. Like,
what is that called? There's some massive cognitive dissonance going on.
Yeah.
With that man, Big L.
Yeah, Big L. My boy, Big L.
Cognitive dissonance, no.
New single dropping soon.
Big L.
And I think cognitive dissonance itself is committing yourself to a life lie, right? It's separating yourself kind of knowingly or sometimes unknowingly from reality and choosing the life lie. And oh no, you start to remake the world.
And I think, Austin, it almost goes beyond the cognitive dissonance into creating your own little fantasy world that isn't true.
Yeah.
That exists apart from reality. That seems dangerous too.
And my mind just explodes to how it relates to the things I've learned about race conversations. How if there's one group of people that's suffering, and then a word you can use for other group of people that's not as suffering would be cognitive dissonance, right? Because you're disassociating cognitively the suffering of another group of people so that you don't feel the need to offer help, I guess. Yeah, that's a whole nother thing, but it relates.
Yeah.
Dang.
I think even, I'll speak for myself, even just the temptation of viewing, I'm idealistic, so viewing things maybe not as they are at times, but as the ideal of like, oh, what it could be, or I'm very optimistic. And at times you do have to reconcile that against what it is.
Yeah.
which slightly different than the reference you just had, Austin, but I think kind of in that same realm of I don't want to view the world as the fairy tale or as the thing that it isn't. You know, I don't want to view it as my own fantasy. I want to view it as it is. And sometimes that you have to reconcile with the ideal and reconcile with the optimism to accept the realness or the reality.
Right on.
Maybe a closing remark that is still very well connected in seeking the truth. On the last page, Peterson says, "The word of God transformed chaos into being through the act of speech. We are made, man and woman are made in the image of God. Therefore, we also can transform chaos into being through speech." And I don't know to what extent that's true, but that definitely, I thought that was a really cool way to end. Like our speech has meaning and is powerful, and it can transform our lives and hopefully transform others in a positive way as well. God transformed the possibility of the universe into existence through the act of speech, the way it's relayed to us in Genesis. And then we get to follow in that example being made in his image and can do that in our lives and in our world as well. And it's funny, I was just stalking myself as being an optimist and an idealist, and that, you know, that's kind of like the most optimistic and idealistic thing to say, but it's also true in this case.
Yeah, praise God for that.
I want to leave on one more thing, and because I was gonna say, how do we bring this in? Like, how do we improve our lives off this conversation? And he says it perfectly right here. It's the last paragraph, the second to last paragraph. "If your life is not what it could be, try telling the truth. In paradise, everyone speaks the truth. That's what makes it paradise."
Thank you for tuning in to this week's book club discussion. Please let us know if you have any suggestions as to books we should read or topics we should discuss by contacting us at beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. We hope you join us next week for another conversation.